introduce our authors for the evening. Annalee Newitz writes science fiction and nonfiction. They're the author of the book Four Lost Cities, we were just talking about at the top of the hour, A Secret History of the Urban Age, and the novels The Future of Another Lifetime, right here, and Autonomous, which won the Lambda Literary Award. They're a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and have a monthly column in New Scientist. They're also the co-host of the Hugo Award-winning podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct. Please welcome Annalee Newitz. Colin Dickey is a writer, speaker, and academic, and has made a career out of collecting unusual objects and hidden histories all over the world. He's the co-editor of the Morbid Anatomy anthology, and he's a member of the Order of the Good Death, a collective of artists, writers, and death industry professionals interested in improving the Western world's relationship with mortality. He's an associate professor of creative writing at National University. His books include Cranioclepty, Afterlives of the Saints, Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places, and his book, The Unidentified, Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and Our Obsession with the Unexplained is the reason we're here tonight. So please join me in welcoming Colin Dickey.
Awesome. I am so excited to talk to you about this book because I love it, and it's full of great yarns and storytelling, as well as sort of cultural critique of the same thing that you're telling us stories about, which is always my favorite. I want to start, Colin, by asking you about kind of where the book begins, which, given that this is a book about the unknown and the fringe, of course it starts in a bar with you talking to a bunch of folks about Lemuria in Shasta, California. And I wonder if you could just tell us that story. Why were you there? How did Lemuria get to be in California? What is it? And what did you find out while you were there?
Yeah, let's start there. So first of all, thanks for doing this. Thanks everybody out there. I want to agree with Casey in the chat that, Annalee, your background is divine. But anyways, okay, so Lemuria, right? So most folks know about the idea of the lost continent of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean. Lemuria is the idea that there's maybe like a similar continent in the Pacific, but its history is a little bit more bizarre. And so you kind of have to go back to like 1864 when a geologist sort of is proposing this idea that there is a connection between Madagascar and India, because he's basically like, look, there are lemurs on Madagascar and India, but not in mainland Africa. So how did they get from one to the other? And plate tectonics hasn't been invented yet. So his proposal is, what if there was a land bridge, like a continent between the two of them that somehow broke apart and sank, right? And so this is, because it's a theory about lemurs, he's like, we'll call it Lemuria. So this idea gets bandied around in sort of scientific circles for a while, and then it gets dropped. It doesn't fit. It doesn't work out, and so it gets dropped. But it gets sort of resurrected by sort of various sort of metaphysical communities, including Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophists, right, who begin to posit that this is like a place of like a kind of lost culture, or sort of, forgotten point in human evolution of these sort of like semi-divine figures that like existed in Lemuria before they sort of like degenerated into human beings today or something like that. So Lemuria, along with Atlantis, starts to take on these kind of quasi-spiritual or metaphysical aspects, right? And then comes this guy, Harvey Louis Spencer, who is a Californian, and by God, he loves California. He thinks California is great. I mean, I love California. You love California. Nobody loves California like this guy. And he proposes, folks in the Bay Area will know him perhaps for the museum he founded, the Rosicrucian Museum in San Jose, California, which I grew up going to. And if you are in the Bay Area and you have not been, I don't know what's open there these days, but when it's open again, you should go, because it's just like a really amazing Egyptology museum. But he also had this idea that California itself was the last remnant of Lemuria, that it basically had broken off and drifted across the ocean and sort of smacked into North America. and that actually the Great Salt Lake was actually the former ocean that separated Lemuria and North America until like Lemuria hit North America and the Sierra Nevadas cut it off, right? So so he starts advocating that Mount Shasta is in fact like the sort of like kind of metaphysical or supernatural or psychic hotspot. And so I was reading about this, and as someone like I grew up in San Jose, went to college in Oregon, spent a lot of time on I-5 driving up and down. So like you've made that drive, you know the way Shasta like just sort of looms out in the distance. It's such a cool place. I don't know, Annalee, have you been to Shasta?
I have, yeah.
Okay, all right.
But
so,
I didn't know about Lemuria. I missed all the cool shit.
Oh yeah, so like, cause I was like, like there were these accounts from like park rangers in the 30s. They're like, there's so many of these weird, kind of pseudoscience kind of kooks here, and we don't know what to do with them. And I thought, well, that's crazy that was happening in the 30s, but that's all in the past. And then I decided to go check it out, and it turns out there's still a lot of folks in Shasta who will tell you that the lost city of Telos, the last remnants of the Lemurians, is under the mountain. And so yeah, as you said, I just sort of like started going to bars and sort of asking people, and like nearly everybody, the server in the bar in my hotel had a story. The bartender at the local dive bar had a story. 3 or 4 patrons had stories. It was just like, the guy at the Mexican restaurant had a story. It's just like everywhere you went, all you had to do, the guy in the sporting goods store, I was just like, hey, what's this about? And, like you get these crazy stories. And like the one bar patron, like the line I love is he's like, half the people in this town believes in this stuff, and the other half wants to kill that first half. Like it's a really weird mix of like Northern California, just kind of rural mountain towny vibe, and Northern California hippie crystal dreamcatcher vibe. And it's been like a very extreme version of both of those together. And yeah, and the stories that I was told, among other things, that they're like Bigfoot is up there, or that Bigfoot is up there, but he's flying around in flying saucers. But also there are these weird fences that are maybe military or government in nature, and maybe there's like secret experiments being done there. And it seemed like the kind of the place where like what all these various strands of the book that became the book all were like coming together. This one mountain sort of, was where the kind of like the cryptids, which are, your Bigfoots and your Loch Ness Monster, your aliens and your UFOs, your lost continents, and your government conspiracies, like all just got sucked into this vortex around this truly striking mountain. Because again, if you've been there, it's like, it's such a beautiful mountain, and it does have this effect on you, regardless of your beliefs. That was a long answer to your question, but there it is.
No, that was super interesting. I think, one of the interesting parts of this book is that as you bring together all of these fringe ideas, like you said, you deal with cryptids and lost continents and UFOs and government conspiracies, and all of those fringe beliefs or conspiracies seem to kind of orbit each other in the United States. Like they, each time you sort of tell a story about lost continents or cryptids, these other ideas kind of creep in about, oh, well, maybe it's aliens too, and probably the government is behind it. And I wonder if, and then of course, California is all part of that as well.
Course,
somehow.
It's the best.
It represents a lot of stuff. And I think that what I'm curious about is, why do you think that constellation of myths kind of fits together in American history? Like, what is it that we're working out as a culture? Because there's lots of fringe beliefs that you could have dealt with in here that you're not dealing with. It's really centered on this collection around monsters, lost continents, aliens, and the government. So what's the kind of, what's connecting them? Like, what's the underlying like desire or fear or sort of psychological issue that you think is kind of bringing these together in America?
Yeah, that was probably the hardest thing for me to do in terms of writing the book and sort of figuring out its scope, because in the beginning it was like conspiracy theories, and it was kind of all over the place. And I wrote about 50,000 words of like book that I ended up cutting out, because at some point I just like I was like, oh, this actually doesn't fit, and I don't want to do this. And I wanted to kind of focus on the things that, I wanted to focus on cryptids and aliens in particular, because honestly, I thought it would be the most fun to write about. It would just be like,
Fair enough.
like in the sense of like, I didn't want this to be like a book that was just like doom and gloom, conspiracy theories are terrible, and they're ruining the world. But I wanted to kind of focus on those things that had like sort of wonder and kind of magic about them. And what happened is as you said, I sort of kept coming back to things like Lemuria and Atlantis, right? So like the first great, UFO tale in Amazing Stories is called I Remember Lemuria. And I was like, well, I've heard that word before, and I kept sort of seeing these things intertwined. And so that's sort of what led to that selection. But then once I did, I was like, okay, what is the thing that connects them? Why are these things intertwined in cultural history like this? So the best hypothesis I have for you is that this all starts, like the books really, after the Shasta section, it really starts with Ignatius Donnelly, who is a land speculator who sort of like pushing out west in the 1860s, and like is going to found this town in Mississippi or Missouri. It might have been the Missouri River, and get rich and whatever. And basically this, seized native land, more or less. And it falls apart. He loses money, but then he ends up going to Congress. He's like in Congress for a couple of years, and then he gets out, and then he writes this book about Atlantis, which is like the first book since Plato to really even more so than Plato, take the idea that Atlantis is a real thing. And I think his story of somebody who is sort of this kind of Anglo embodiment of manifest destiny that then imagines Atlantis, that became the sort of key to understanding for me, like what is happening here is that, particularly from like a sort of Western Anglo North America, sort of white, for lack of a better term, mind, the world is filled in by the end of the 19th century. North America has been, the sort of takeover of North America is complete. The colonization of Africa is complete. There's like less and less, what Joseph Conrad calls white spaces on the map. And that creates, I think, a kind of weird nostalgia and yearning for the undiscovered country, right? For what exists beyond the fringe of civilization. And so, like my last book, Ghostland, was really based around the idea of architecture and what it meant to be in a building of whatever kind. And I think this book is really about frontiers and all the sort of kind of problematic and sort of optimistic aspects of frontiers. And what I found is that the thing about cryptids and UFOs is they're always on the edge of civilization. It's the aliens at the, in the Nevada desert, an hour from Las Vegas. It's the Sasquatch in the Redwood Forest 2 hours from San Francisco. It's like, they're not like totally far out of civilization. They're just sort of on the edge. And I think that what I would say is that these creatures not only sort of exist in that sort of just untouched landscape, they also create that untouched landscape. Because if you believe in Bigfoot, you can believe that there's always a part of, California or, British Columbia or wherever that's perpetually untouched, that perpetually sort of out of reach of civilization. And it's like, there's never going to be a Starbucks in Atlantis. There's never going to be a McDonald's in Lemuria. So these places then become, like in our imagination, they become this place that is sort of outside the reach of modernity and industrialization, and it's filled with these sort of strange and amazing creatures.
So it's kind of a compensatory fantasy for people who've colonized everything, and they're like, but we just want more untouched something, like some mystery. I loved how when you tracked a lot of the stories of the cryptids, you did find that they'd originated in these border zones, like that literally they were at, the border between like white settler colonists and Indian country, or they were right between two nations that were contesting an area. And so they really were literally on borders, like borders between nations. And so, yeah, I think it really you have a kind of haunted America feeling in this book that's really interesting. I wanted to ask you about another thread that I saw throughout the book and that you deal with a lot, particularly when you're talking about cryptids and UFOs, which is the relationship between these fringe beliefs and mainstream science. And a lot of this myth making that we see in this book starts in the 19th century when the scientific method is becoming widely accepted and science is becoming, professionalized. And so these sort of fringe groups and conspiracy theorists, sometimes they're inspired by science, sometimes they're anti-science. And it feels very, it feels like this is a strand in fringe thinking that continues right up to today. Like we're in a moment right now where we're seeing a lot of anti-science, but it's connected with these fringe beliefs, whether it's like hydrochloroquine or some other kind of wacky fake science. And I wonder if you could just kind of talk a little bit about where science fits into cryptids and how people who are hunting cryptids are both themselves kind of scientists, but kind of revolting against science. It's such an interesting position for these monster hunters to be in.
Yeah, no, it is really strange, and it's really all over the map. You find some people who are very anti-science. You find other people who are, Lauren Coleman, who runs the International Cryptozoology Museum in Portland, Maine, does, well, not this year, but he normally does a conference every year. I don't know, have you been to any of those?
I haven't, but I've talked to Lauren from my IO9 days. We did a summer, a cryptid summer where we were encouraging people to go out and hunt for cryptids and send in their pictures. And, so he was a judge. Nice. Yeah, no, it was really fun. Somebody's actually won with a picture of a white tiger, which is apparently like an actual, it's a real animal, but it is also classified as a cryptid somehow. Wow.
Well, lucky you, because he blew me off repeatedly and he never let me interview him for the book.
Well, so. I burned that bridge for you. It's my fault. But he doesn't trust journalists anymore.
But he does this conference, and the one that I went to, he had a primatologist from Columbia. It might have been NYU, but I think he was from Columbia. So, sort of like talking about real primatology, like what, and basically, at one point just sort of like, I mean, he was very good natured about the whole thing, but he's like, stop sending me hair samples and footprints, get me video, get me clear quality video, so like, but yeah, so it does sort of run the gambit. But you're right. I think that, what I found, like two things, like one that I talk about in the book is like the sort of rise of Linnaean taxonomy, this idea that you can slot every single thing, every animal, every living creature into this framework, and like everything can be in it. And if you find a new weird thing, it's fine because you can just, adapt and enlarge the framework, but everything will have a place. And that kind of totalizing feature of science is a lot of what sort of fringe theorists push back on. They sort of want, and the cryptid hunters there are some cryptid hunters, not all, but some who really want to believe in things that simply like won't fit in somehow to that taxonomy, which sort of exist in some other place and time, that they are like somehow, sort of borderline supernatural. And particularly now, I think where a lot of cryptid hunters are going now is sort of increasingly towards kind of the paranormal in some sense, and they're talking a lot about Dogman, who is like, can like talk apparently, and so it's like much closer.
I don't know about Dogman.
Yeah, Dogman, yeah. So like, so speaking of Godzilla, like, Bigfoot used to be the scary thing, but then now that Dogman is a thing, now Bigfoot is like the human protector. And so Dogman is malevolent, and Bigfoot, like Godzilla, has now become the guy.
Yeah. And it's kind of, it's like Mexican wrestling. Like you can always switch sides, and it's even better. Yeah.
So because I talked to these guys who were telling me about this ghost hunt they did in upstate New York, and it's like, so we went, and then we saw these glowing red eyes, and then there was Dogman, and and then Dogman was attacked by Bigfoot, and we saw this battle between Bigfoot and Dogman, and I was like, it's like, guys, you're just gilding the lily. It's just too much. Like, you know, like if you had just said the glowing red eyes, it would have been a cool story, but you're just laying it on so thick that it's like, I just can't go there with you, you know? And so,
well, that's what happens in sequels. You've got to
Right.
have like more and more monsters fighting, and
Right.
like it's just hard to keep up the momentum, you know?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that didn't answer your question at all, but.
Well, okay, so let me like, it was a long kind of meandering question, but I want to at least push on the last little bit of it, which was, why do you think that at this moment in history we're kind of returning to that anti-science feeling in our fringe beliefs? Because I think fringe beliefs kind of run the gamut. They're not all anti-science. Some of them are kind of parallel to science, or they're just straight up mystical. So what's going on now that's kind of making that feeling come back for Americans?
I mean, I think you can talk about a lot of things, and I think there's a sort of constellation of things that, like, shocks to the kind of public confidence in science that happened in the 70s and 80s, and they include things like the Tuskegee experiment, the Challenger disaster, and the sort of colossal failure of a response to HIV/AIDS. And like, I don't know that any of those individually are dispositive, and there are others as well. Various like groundwater poisonings, and but I think there was this real moment when, or not a moment, but there have been a series of shocks when a lot of our sort of casual confidence in large corporations, scientific experts, the government, like, we're like legitimately shaken. Tobacco industry, another sort of like obvious example of like, these people know science, and they know that this stuff is killing us, and they don't care.
It was literally a conspiracy. Like,
yeah, exactly.
It wasn't even made up conspiracy.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So. And what's depressing is the way in which that, those sort of legitimate concerns then gave expression to things that were like totally illegitimate, like, the anti-vax, conspiracy or something like that. So you have this thing where it's like, you shake the public's confidence in things, and then you kind of have to reap what you sow, because then what you get is like this kind of like diffuse, like ever widening sphere of things that like are untrustworthy, because at that point people are like, well, nothing is true. I can make up whatever belief I want to make up on my own. And so these kind of like, like in a perfect world, what would have happened is you would have had a kind of more performative attempt to sort of reestablish that sense of confidence, sort of owning these mistakes rather than just sort of trying to cover them up, like a sort of like kind of like a truth and reconciliation kind of idea where, you can like have the scientific community come forward and say like, yes, these are the errors, these were the ethical failures, this is what we should have done, and here's how we want to hope to build back your trust. And instead, we just have had this kind of slow slide towards people kind of picking and choosing, which conspiracies to believe or not believe, and it runs the gamut from things that are, specifically harmful, like anti-vax, to things that are just sort of weirdly nebulous, chemtrails or 5G or like GMO stuff. It's like everybody sort of has their own kind of filter set of what they think is like harmful and what they think is fine. So.
Yeah, I also like the point that you made in the book that, especially in kind of the early 20th century, as science was becoming a profession, and so it was starting to be something where you couldn't be a scientist unless you were like went to college, and you of course had to have the money to go to college, and you got this kind of rash of fringe believers who kind of were fashioning themselves as outsider scientists, people who hadn't been, anointed by like traditional science institutions. And they were kind of, it almost felt like it was a populist move, or they were rebelling against, maybe not even populist, just rebelling against elitism and saying like, well, hey, we can discover things. Like, why do you have to have a degree to discover things, Right. And I feel like maybe there's something like that going on now too, with, the breakdown of our university systems, and like questioning what counts as education and who gets to be an authority. And that people are kind of, that there's, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, it feels like there's a kind of legitimate protest going on against some of the problems of science, at the same time that, yes, of course, we don't want people going around saying like, I've discovered that vaccines can turn you into a chicken or whatever, you know.
Right.
If only that was the belief, that would be kind of awesome.
Yeah. I think you're right, because I think with a lot of these beliefs, they're motivated by something legitimate. And that I think is always, that's why I think it doesn't work to just like, you know, dismiss and yell at people who, you know, believe something strange. Like there's some legitimate fear or belief that's underpinning them. And that is driving the belief way more so than any sort of allegiance to like the facts or truth. And so it doesn't work to just simply say, you know, oh, you're wrong, and here's the scientific community telling you you're wrong. Like, because that's, you know, like, and again, I was that person 5 years ago. I was exactly the person on like, you know, like a, you know, distant cousin or coworker's wall who they would post something about, you know, some conspiracy theory, and I would like hammer them with the facts, and it would turn into a flame war, and then we'd never speak again. And I was like, no, that actually doesn't work, because there's something that makes the conspiracy theory like comforting or pleasing or reassuring. I've been thinking about this today. You know, there's the Levi-Strauss phrase, you know, conspiracy theories are good to think with. You know, they give you something that the state of the world does not give you. And that's why people draw, you know, and that's why people from the left and the right, and that's why, you know, people with PhDs and people, you know, like medical doctors, like still, you know, embrace these things for various reasons. You know, and some of them also turn out to be legit conspiracies, you know, like as, you know, we were saying. So like, so it's not always totally crazy. It's not always totally malevolent or paranoid, but it is like, if it's a thing you want to actually like diffuse and debunk, it takes a lot more than just like spitting out the facts at people, because that's sort of the least interesting part of why somebody subscribes to a conspiracy theory.
I think that's true. And I love that you say in the book that like debunking something doesn't help at all. Like, and in fact, when something is debunked, it often becomes more powerful and persuasive, like Lemuria, right? It's debunked in the scientific community, but then it becomes like central to so many of these fringe belief systems. So I guess like, as we struggle with trying to, you know, deal with this new upwelling of conspiracy theories that we're surrounded with today, especially in the States, what do we do with those? Like, I agree with you, like debunking doesn't seem to work, like coming and being like, well, don't you know, like lemurs actually got here because of continental drift, and like, bring back the lemurs, I think. But so what do we do with those beliefs? Like, what's a good way to think about them? What's a good way to respond to them that isn't just that kind of rejection?
Yeah, well, right. And again, I mean, you know, like one of the reasons I wrote the book the way I did, because it started out just being like conspiracy theories, and I was just going to prove them false, you know, whatever. And like, and where I got to was like, okay, I'm going to try and see if I can do a kind of almost genealogy of a certain kind of like yearning and kind of longing that sort of coincides with a set of beliefs that some of which are totally harmful. And again, I don't, you know, like I got to the end of it, I was like, look, you know, like I think if you believe that Bigfoot is real, awesome, you know, like I don't,
doesn't hurt anyone.
Know, right, exactly, you know, and what was interesting to me was thinking about how in a lot of ways like Bigfoot or you know, cryptids and UFOs sort of begin from a similar point, but one of them remains mostly anodyne, sometimes a little anti-science, but mostly anodyne, and the other one gets very dark and very paranoid very fast. And and
UFOs
UFOs, you know, and like and becomes sort of inextricable from a deep-seated distrust of government and the sense that like the world is sort of like, you know, like false, you know, that there's something sort of like just like you're being played, you know, which you don't get with the chupacabra, like you know. So that was kind of like one of my ways of answering that question, sort of very broadly, was to write a book that barely talked about it, but you know, instead talked about this kind of like longing for like this kind of frontier magic or something, this longing for like the thing that's on the edge of things that like then sort of like prompts and drives a certain sort of set of beliefs and a certain sort of like kinds of expressions. But I think that question of like what to do, what I've found that works, honestly, is like I found that, crucially, you have to validate people's fears and their beliefs and figure out what it is that is motivating them to seek out that conspiracy. Like you have to figure out what that conspiracy theory is doing for them, and like why it's good for them to think that way. Why and that's going to be slightly different for everybody. Sometimes it's going to be, fear and anxiety. Like there's a great study that I love of about 10 years ago. These researchers, they show people two images. One image has like a bunch of just like scribbly lines and just like visual noise. The other one also has visual noise, but then behind it is a drawing of like a hat or something, right? Mm-hmm. So you show people the one with a hat. You say, do you see anything? And people say, yeah, I see a hat. Then you show them the other one, which is just the visual noise. And you say, do you see anything? And some people are like, no, I just see lines. And other people say, yeah, I see a horse or I see a car. It's like that apophenia, right? Mm-hmm. And they do a psychological profile of the people who see the shape where there's no shape. And what they found is that people who saw something saw a pattern where there was not anything there tended to be people who one way or another felt out of control in their lives. They felt, financially or professionally or romantically or, with their families or whatever, they felt like out of control. And so the conclusion is when you're feeling out of control, you look for order and patterns, even if they don't necessarily exist, because that becomes a kind of reassuring thing for you. And so right now we're in like this very uncertain time, and again, you see, and the past 4 years, particularly, you've seen conspiracy theories swing widely from across the political spectrum. So right after Trump's inauguration, there was a flurry of left-wing conspiracy theories, from a part of the country who just felt like, oh my God, we've lost everything. This is madness. This is like psychosis, and so, went to conspiracy theories as a way of kind of making sense of things. And then sort of as Trump's popularity fell and things started to kind of fall apart in the administration, and then when they lost the midterms, you get the rise of QAnon, and you get the rise of this idea of like, this is now like a right-wing conspiracy theory, which is now also trying to explain why things aren't turning out the way we hope they would turn out. And so that's just like one of many different ways I think why these things would manifest in a given person. And it really is frustratingly, it's not a silver bullet. It's like cult deprogramming. It's like working with people sort of, people have like sent me things like, well, what do you think about this? And I've written them like 6,000 or 7,000 word emails, just sort of like patiently kind of like going through, because like, if I'm like, well, this is nonsense, then, that's not going to accomplish anything, so that's, so it's a hard one, but that's what I end up doing now.
And I think, honestly, I think this book does a great job of that kind of deprogramming that you're talking about, where instead of saying these are wrong, you're like, well, this is where it comes from, and this is like why people believe this. And this is like, where Lemuria comes from. It started with lemurs. Like, I didn't know lemurs were involved, and I'm very excited about I'm going to keep bringing up the lemurs. But also, like, the same thing goes for Bigfoot and for the UFO conspiracies, which of course emerge at the height of the Cold War, when this is like a period of extreme paranoia. And so I wanted to, before I open it up for questions, so if you want to ask a question, by the way, you can ask by pushing the little button in Zoom that lets you get to the Q&A page. So feel free to start poking questions into there. I wanted to talk to you about Charles Fort, because he is a figure who kind of comes up again and again in the book as both a guy who helps kind of propagate fringe science, but also as kind of a model for like thinking about conspiracy theories and fringe science. So Fort, for folks who don't know, he's kind of the grandfather of parascience, fringe science. And there is a magazine, Fortean Times, which is probably online now. It's probably not physical anymore, but it reports on really cool shit. And a lot of it is legitimately unexplained. But you talk a couple of times about how there's a kind of, I almost want to say there's like a conservative interpretation of Fortean thinking and a more progressive interpretation. And the progressive interpretation feels like the side of Fort, which like inspires us to have an open mind And then there's a more conservative way that his ideas get appropriated to, kind of bolster biases. I wonder if you could just talk about that, like how Charles Fort kind of allows us to think about these two approaches to fringe science.
Yeah,
fringe conspiracies. It's not just fringe science, but
it's a really good way of putting it, because I think, I mean, I love Ford, and you're right. He's kind of like a North Star through a lot of this book, but in a very weirdly unstable way, because so Ford, again, for folks who don't know this, like Ford starts out writing these crank books. He has this book that's like human behavior is controlled by radio waves beamed from Mars or something like that. And it's like, he can't get it published. Nobody will publish it. And the manuscript is lost. So we don't know what it is other than like him describing it in some letters and stuff. But like the thing that he writes instead, the Book of the Damned, doesn't advocate a theory in the same way. It sort of gathers up all these really weird, unexplained phenomenon. And his attitude is basically like, you just have to accept that this happened. This is in the historical record. People saw this, people wrote about it, people talked about it, and so like it's a collection of like, frogs falling from the sky and like, blood rains or ball lightning or, bizarre fish that emerged after earthquakes and like, just like, and famously the Great Kentucky Meat Shower. But, so
covered extensively in your work.
Right, exactly, yeah. So the I guess the conservative way, to use your word, is the people who like take this as proof of whatever conspiracy or pseudoscience that they're advocating. And certainly Fort at times falls into that category himself. There are moments where Fort will sort of advocate some very outlandish thing, or he will sort of go on a rant against, scientific knowledge in ways that are, you're like, oh, Charles, like it's like a little embarrassing. But then the cool moments in Fort is when he just puts it out there for you without giving you a theory, without like, he talks about the Great Kentucky Meat Shower, and he says like, all of these scientific explanations for why meat fell from the sky in Olympian Springs, Kentucky on, March 1876 suck. None of them are good, but this stuff happened. And like, and so for me, it's almost like a sort of like meditative process in the sense of like, once you give into a theory about why these things happened, you run the risk of like becoming, a crank, becoming an Ignatius Donnelly or conspiracy theorist or whatever, because often those theories just don't hold up. They don't work, and yet you cling to them because you're like, now that's my theory. And, Stephen King did shoot John Lennon, but like, if you can kind of hold these like moments of wonder, and, like by the end of the book, I basically, there's a handful of things where like by the end of the book, I'm like, look, I don't, like people are like, Colin, you're a big debunker and you're a skeptic. I'm like, no, because there are like legit things that I do not understand and I don't have an explanation for, and they are awesome. They are strange and cool, and what a great weird world. And maybe in 50 years we'll have like a perfectly airtight scientific explanation for them. But for right now, it's just like what happened in Lawndale, Illinois in 1977? Who knows? But it's amazing, right? Like what was the Gloucester sea serpent? I don't know, but you don't either, and that's awesome. And so like, like I really, like I hope to like, like I was like, I want to sort of figure out how these things, these kind of moments of wonder, like where they came from, what motivated them, and how in some ways they kind of like went sour. But I also want to kind of keep open that space that there is still like the unexplained and strangeness in the world. And that's cool. So.
Yeah. And it's something that we need, right? Like it's part of what gives us like hope and keeps us searching for new stuff. And, like if we didn't believe that some things couldn't be explained at all, like it's just like, okay, what the fuck is this? I have no idea. That's what drives scientific knowledge, is like saying, I don't know, let's try to find out. And let's not foreclose the possibility. Let's not say like, well, it was definitely wolves from Mars with like, implants, probably driven by like leftists. It's probably Antifa wolves from Mars. I don't know. I'm just like writing really bad science fiction right now.
Antifa wolves from Mars is a really bad name for a band.
Exactly. Antifa is from Mars, fascists are from Venus. I don't know. It all fits together somehow. But I like that idea that it's sort of like the opening up is the kind of progressive side, and then it's the closing down and saying like, well, it's definitely those guys, like it's definitely the government, or it's definitely like
I feel like you could just say you don't know, and that's cool. Like you could just be like I love that this thing happened. I love there's a story about it. You know, like I love that the historical record is like it's kind of open in this weird way, you know, and I love that like these things won't happen again. You know, if the Gloucester sea serpent were to reappear today in the way that it did in 1816, it would be like everybody would know what it was, and there would be no mystery in the same way. But like there was this mystery, and it got caught, you know, in history in this weird way. And I think that's so cool. And I'm happy to just let that be without demanding it demonstrate some preconceived idea.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so we have a question from Chelsea Johnson. And
hi, Chelsea.
Hi, Chelsea. We love you. She also tells us that we're wonderful, but she also has a question. She asks, when have you felt yourself susceptible to seeing a pattern where it isn't? Have you ever been prone to believing in a conspiratorial idea, and what was it?
I mean, yeah, totally. And like, you know, especially because, you know, I sometimes sort of like default to a kind of like skepticism. I had to like keep reminding myself, like I kept in the forefront of my mind, Watergate, Iran-Contra, the Catholic sex abuse scandal, and the tobacco lobby, in the sense that like, I was like, these are actual conspiracies. They are like, they have been exposed as such, they are real, and conspiracies do exist. And like, you don't need to dismiss everything. Where I like, you know, as I said, there are things in the book that I'm just like, I don't know, like could be, you know, like I have no answer for you. You know, I don't, that doesn't mean necessarily that like I have like a conspiratorial theory, but I'm also like willing to listen, you know, like I'm, you know, like, but you know what, so a good example of like sort of how these things work and what I've found is that, Bob Lazar is this guy who's the first guy to really, you know, reveal that there are aliens at Area 51. He sort of like, you know, puts Area 51, so to speak, on the map. And he says he worked there. He says he saw some amazing stuff. He gets a lot of press. Everybody's like, whoa, you know, like, so Bob becomes the kind of famous guy. And one of the stories he tells is there's a meeting between the government scientists and the aliens in the late 70s. And there's a misunderstanding, a miscommunication. Things go wrong in a wacky kind of way. And the aliens pull out their laser guns and liquidate all the scientists and just kill them all. So like 50 scientists end up dead, you know, so sad, right? You know, sorry. But the question then becomes, you know, Bob, where are the obituaries? What about the families? Why aren't there families out in front of Area 51 saying, you know, we want justice for our like husbands and wives and brothers or whomever, you know, it's like, you know, and so Bob has to sort of refine the story. And he says, and I'm saying Bob as though we're best friends. I'm not, I don't know him. But
I mean, we don't need to stand on ceremony here.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But he refines the story and he says, okay, well, what happens is the government goes around to orphanages and they find orphans without any family members who are adept in science. And then they adopt them and raise them up to be scientists. And it's basically his way of saying,
wow,
like,
it's like the X-Men.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea that like, that's why there's no obituaries and nobody misses them when the aliens liquidate them. And so like the thing I like try and remember is like conspiracies require a logistical headache, you know, and they require a lot of like foot soldiers, right? Like when Woodward and Bernstein like unearthed Watergate, who gives them a lot of information? It's the secretaries, right? Because Nixon's not shredding his own documents, like somebody else is doing that, you know? And so like, so with this is not, Chelsea's like, what have you been susceptible to? And I'm like, instead being like, I'm not susceptible to anything, I'm amazing. But it is like, it is a thing that I run through. It's like, okay, if this conspiracy theory were to be real, who would take out the trash? Like, you know, who would wire the money? Like, how would it like actually work? And again, like with Watergate or with like the Catholic Church, like there are answers to that and they make sense. And there's a reason that things happen the way they happen. Whereas with some of the more outlandish ones, it's like, it requires this sort of, not just suspension of belief, but a sort of belief in the perfection of human agency, which is rarely in evidence. So.
Yeah. Stephen King has a great line somewhere in one of his many books where he says, perfect paranoia is perfect awareness. And I think that's part of the wish fulfillment, you know, is like, okay, now I know everything.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Yeah.
Yeah. We have a question from a different Chelsea with their first name ends with S-E-A instead of S-E-Y.
Hi, other Chelsea.
Hello, other Chelsea. I don't know why I needed to spell your name at great length. But anyway, so Chelsea asks, do you think there's differences between the mindset or social conditions that lend themselves to supernatural conspiracies, like aliens, for example, versus conditions that lend themselves to non-supernatural ones, like government cover-ups?
That's a really great question. And I do think I think partly there's a lot of blur and overlap. So a lot of these, you know, there's been studies that people who believe in one conspiracy theory tend to believe in multiple. So like if you believe JFK was assassinated, you also believe in, I don't know, the earth is flat or whatever, or, you know, like whatever, like, you know, that there's like, once you believe one, you know, it's like, oh, you know, we'll have another.
Collect them all, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, but that being said, I think that different stories operate on different parts of like how we see the world. And so one of the things I think I found with this book is that like cryptid belief tends to be about our relationship to nature and like sort of feeling some sort of disconnect or maybe sort of some yearning or longing for like a natural world that, you know, feels beyond our reach or whatever. Alien belief in this very different way feels about who we are as people, you know, and sort of like a reflection of like our maybe estrangement towards like, you know, our own humanity, which is why, you know, aliens both sort of look like us, but they're not us. And maybe they're like space brothers, or maybe they're like, you know, creepy big-eyed children. And like, you know, and they sort of change and adapt. So like, and I think government conspiracy theories furthermore have a different valence, which has a lot to do with our sense of control in the world. You know, like, I mean, like if you're feeling out of control in the world, if you're feeling maybe that your, you know, your social group or your demographic group is maybe losing power or is maybe being denied power, it's not unusual to gravitate to a sort of, you know, governmental explanation for that. Some of which, like, again, are like based in fact, you know, because this country has like a history of like specifically singling out various groups and oppressing them. Others are, you know, others are less so, or others are sort of like, you know, like, you know, there are a lot of conspiracy theories about the government in Black culture, which are sort of literally fictional, but are sort of expressions of actual systemic racism that then gets like fed through, you know, these sort of bizarre conspiracy theories. So like, so all these things, you know, and again, you know, like, you know, anyways, we could go on. So yeah, so I do think it's about like these different conspiracy theories operate on different sets of psychological beliefs and fears. And that seems to be sort of like a genre distinction. So.
That's so interesting. Chris Spurgeon has a question. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Chris.
He asks, are conspiracy beliefs a universal trait, or is it a uniquely Western thing?
Oh, I would assume, I don't think that I'm super qualified to speak about non-Western culture because I'm, you know, it's just not my background, but I think that, yes, they're universal. They're definitely universal. And in fact, I mean, I certainly came across things. There is, for example, there's a, and again, I can't speak too much to this, but if you want to know more, there are a lot of theories in various Middle Eastern communities about like Israel, for example, manipulating animals to do various like surveillance and psyops, like, you know, train dolphins and falcons and things like that. So like, so they're out there. But as, you know, I kind of alluded to in the last answer, like different conspiracy theories do different things for different communities. And so, you know, that's why, you know, I sort of felt a little bit out of my element going too far outside of like, you know, Western conspiracy theories, because I felt like I could better diagnose like what these conspiracy theories were working on, or these, but not all conspiracy, but, you know, what these fringe beliefs were working on.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I think that's what I liked, is that I felt like this book was very rooted in like United States culture. Like some of it is kind of coming over from other places, England and people who are immigrating to the States, but like it felt like you were tracking very specifically United States fringe beliefs that like had really kind of taken root here and like become super popular here. So I think that's right. Like that this is whatever's happening elsewhere, this is what we're doing here. And it has to do with our specific history. All right, so here's one more question from Chelsea Johnson. she's wondering how you're feeling about astrology and its enormous popularity right now.
This is where I get into trouble because think it's great. I think it's great. I will say kind of as I alluded to before, I think in moments, I think, belief in astrology tends to wax and wane, and in cultural moments when there is a lot of uncertainty and chaos and sort of, people feel less in control of their lives, I think, astrology becomes quite meaningful for them in the sense that it provides a structure, like it provides a way of understanding people. It provides a way of sort of understanding yourself and sort of, I've talked to a lot of astrology believers, and, for some it's just sort of like a, daily meditation prompt. And for other people, it's like, the gravitational pull of the planets when you're born affects the water in your body, and that then sort of, shapes and controls your physiology, and that sort of, and everywhere in between, I think the easiest way is that, for a lot of people, it gives them a means of shaping experience and perception in times when maybe things feel a little bit sort of out of control and stuff like that. So,
yeah. It also has that sense of wonder too, that you were talking about earlier, that idea that there's like, especially because I feel like anything that's connected to the stars and kind of the celestial, the heavens, it's like, it's one of the places where science and religion kind of agree, which is like the heavens are badass. And right. And that was, again, one of the things that I feel like you deal with really nicely in this book is that fringe beliefs are this effort to reconcile kind of myth and spirituality with science. Right. And so I feel like astrology is one of those places where that happens a lot, where there's like you said, there's the very weird pseudoscience beliefs around like water or whatever. But then just this kind of like, well, but like the stars are so great, they're just awesome. And like, you can study them as science, you can study them as like affecting your mood. But either way, they're so pretty.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing I would say, positively about astrology is I think, it also creates a sense of community, which I think is also, like QAnon is an example of how like a actual conspiracy theory can create community in ways that are really kind of disturbing. But like, astrology, I think people who, like enjoy sharing that kind of, I had one person explain to me that, it was from their perspective, it was, particularly in the queer community, for those of us who were raised in religious backgrounds, but felt estranged from religion, because of our families or our parents, and sort of left, the religion at the same time we left our parents, astrology is a way of sort of like, it's a kind of religion that is free of some of the more sort of, trans or homophobic or misogynist aspects of some, expressions of patriarchal religion. So again, I think you get a wide variety of things. What people draw from it really sort of depends on a lot of factors. And, I think for the most part, it's cool.
Yeah, I do too. It seems very benign and kind of therapeutic. Yeah. So,
sure. Yeah.
All right. So, well, that was a great place to end with the therapeutic value. Wait, what?
Yeah, no, I did, because I did threaten to do this, but I do, if we have just like one more minute, Annalee, can you talk about your book that's coming up? Because I do feel that there's like a cool overlap.
Yeah, no, there is a huge overlap.
And Lemuria and the cities that you write about. So can you just?
Yeah, so I have a book coming out in early February called 4 Lost Cities. And it's funny because it kind of goes the opposite direction from Colin's work, where Colin is really diving into like Atlantis and Lemuria and like all of these lost places and lost creatures that are mythological. And my book is about archaeology and the effort to uncover the real cities that people occupied that became mythologized. So I'm looking at like Pompeii, for example, and Angkor, both of which were heavily mythologized, really widely misunderstood. And so my book it's not debunking, it's just sort of getting back to what life was really like in those cities. And it's based on a lot of really recent archaeology. I went out to all the sites and hung out with archaeologists as much as they would let me, and bribed them with alcohol and all the things that you do with archaeologists to keep them happy. And I discovered a lot of really cool shit about these cities that really isn't being talked about that much. And so if you want to know like what life was like for a regular person living in Angkor, or like a freed slave living in Pompeii, which actually the majority of people were freed slaves. It was really quite common way to enter the middle class, basically. Or if you're really interested in mound cities, Cahokia, which was the biggest city in North America before Europeans arrived. It's an enormous mound city full of huge mounds that look like pyramids. That's what the book is about. So it's a lot of yarn spinning, but also a lot of cool science and learning about what our real history actually was like. So it's definitely no Atlantis.
Well, somebody described my book to me the other day, particularly with the Jersey Devil, as like a palimpsest. You know, that like you start with something and then culturally, generation by generation, you layer stuff over. And that's like the progression of this book. And it feels like your book is very much like in the reverse direction of like starting with the myth and the myth conception and sort of digging back down sort of literally as well.
That's right. And that is what archaeology does, is try to get through all of those layers. So in fact, the word palimpsest is used a lot by archaeologists. They're very excited about that. So yeah, anyway, so thank you so much, you guys, for coming. And thanks for chatting with me, Colin. I had like 7,000 more questions to ask you, but I'm not.
Oh, well, let's just hang out until 4 in the morning. It'll be fine.
No, I got my edibles over here, so. Right, exactly. That's Part 2.
These people will hang out with us. No, I'm kidding. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you so much, Green Apple, for hosting. That was really nice. It was really fun.
You two are such a delight. Thank you so much for joining us. And thanks, everyone. I really could just hang out and like listen to you talk and like, let's talk about Roswell and etc. Oh, so exciting, so fun. Palimpsest, very cool. I do want to say thank you to everyone for joining us, and thanks for everyone in the chat and for asking really great questions too. And I'll just plug these books once more before we head out here. We have both Colin and Annalee's book in our store. And thank you both so much for joining us. Let me know when Antifa Wolves from Mars goes on tour.
I know, that's right. We got to work on that conspiracy theory. Excellent. All right, cool. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, folks.
Goodbye, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye.
You too.